Good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth installment of the virtual Abraham Lincoln Institute Symposium, hosted by Ford's Theater. My name is Jonathan White, and I'm chairman of the board of the Abraham Lincoln Institute. Normally, we meet at Ford's Theater every March to hear wonderful speakers talk about the life and legacy of our 16th president. This year, we had to cancel our annual symposium, but we are grateful to Ford's for offering to host a series of live webcasts with our speakers. I want to thank ALI President Ron Sudalter for making arrangements with our speakers, and the team at Ford's for making it all happen. In particular, I'd like to thank Paul Tatro, Erica Scott, Carolina Dulce, Gary Erskine, Juliana Avery, Colleen Pryor, Lauren B.A., and David McKenzie. Throughout the lecture, you can post questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. Our speaker will address them at the end of the program. On Twitter, please use the hashtag Ford's ALI. Our speaker today is James Lundberg, and I will add here that he goes by Jake. Dr. Lundberg is the Director of Undergraduate Studies in History and Assistant Teaching Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. Today, he will be speaking about his recent book, Horace Greeley, Print, Politics, and the Failure of American Nationhood, which was recently published by Johns Hopkins University Press. The Wall Street Journal calls it well-crafted and filled with insight. It is my pleasure to welcome Jake Lundberg.
Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thanks to Ron and Erica and everyone at Ford's Theater who put this together. Obviously, the world has much bigger problems right now, but I was really sad to have the symposium canceled. And I'm really delighted that we've gotten to have at least some version of it in this online format. There are, of course, many places that I could start a brief talk about my book and the story I tell about Horace Greeley in it. But I want to start with an item that I found some years ago, never mind how many, in a printed collection of editorials from the secession crisis. It comes from a short-lived Washington, D.C. newspaper in February of 1861. The Union, of course, was crumbling in the interregnum between Lincoln's election and inauguration. And this newspaper laid much of the blame for the seemingly inexorable slide of events at the feet of Horace Greeley, founder and editor of the New York Tribune. According to the editorial, Horace Greeley was, quote, a bad man, one of the worst men, if not the worst man in America. The present crisis, so full of impending evil to our common country, in a great measure has been brought about by his agency. This was a prime example of what a Worcester, Massachusetts editor had defined 5 years earlier as Greeley phobia. That is, quote, the habit some people have of attributing all the evils of the land to Horace Greeley. Now, just to be clear, this 1861 editorial wasn't talking about Greeley's controversial endorsement of secession late in 1860. It was instead tapping into an idea that was circulating on the eve of the Civil War. And this was the idea that the press, that newspapers, and their cynical editors, Horace Greeley prominent among them, had somehow helped to bring this terrible calamity of disunion upon the nation. Now, when we think about the complex forces and factors that brought the United States to that moment, to the moment of disunion, standing on the brink of civil war, this is, of course, is a wild oversimplification. Newspapers in general, much less a single newspaper editor, did not break up the Union or spark the Civil War. There is, of course, much, much, much more to it than that. But nonetheless, that document and others like it that blamed newspapers and journalists like Greeley for disunion really struck me. And they struck me because they ran so strongly against Greeley's whole conception of journalism, of his work as an editor, and more broadly, the foundational ideas underlying the massive expansion of the press in the United States in the early Republic and into the antebellum period. From his earliest days in journalism, Greeley had thought about the purpose of newspapers in a very, very different way. Newspapers, information, what people in the 19th century called intelligence, these were supposed to unite rather than divide. They were supposed to help knit the Union together, not tear it apart. So the fact that this editorial could have been written, that a person could have strung together those thoughts, spoke in some measure to the frustration of Greeley's visions for journalism and for himself as an editor. At the same time, recognizing the exact inherent in the claim that Horace Greeley had somehow brought the nation to this point, I wondered, what was this person talking about? What would that argument be? And in thinking through the answers to that question, I came to what I see as a great irony in Greeley's career. And that is that in spite of his own mission to be a kind of nation builder through print, Greeley had been instrumental in the 1850s in reshaping the narrative of national politics as one of sectional conflict. He had, in effect, reached the height of his powers as a journalist, not as a voice and symbol of national unity, but instead as one of sectional divide. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes exploring these two closely related points. First, Greeley's vision of the press and the role of the editor as agents of uplift, unity, and consensus. And second, the success and failures of that vision, depending on how you look at it, in the 1850s. And from there, I'll reflect briefly on what I think this means for understanding Greeley more broadly. So as I said, Horace Greeley believed that the purpose of printed communication was to elevate, to uplift, and to forge unity. And he was really shaped by ideas in the early republic, features of Protestant culture of rural New England, and ideas that were built into the practices of American nationalism, again, in the early republic. And these are the idea that printed texts had great power to mold characters and to shape and improve individuals, and that printed texts, especially newspapers, were essential to knitting the American nation together. This is an idea that played out during the Revolution and was codified in a variety of different ways in the early republic. Thinking of the creation of the Postal Service with its generous subsidies for the distribution and circulation of newspapers. This of course was undergirded by the ideas that newspapers and the information that was contained could be the foundation on which a national unity could be built. And there's also the example of Noah Webster, who thought language itself could be a way to tie the nation together. Here a little bit later is Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing writing in 1829, talking about the power of communication to make us into one people by preserving us from being broken into different communities. It does much toward making us one by admitting free communication between distant parts of the country, which no other channel of intercourse can bring together. It binds the whole country in a chain of sympathies and makes it, in truth, one great neighborhood. Well, Greeley, as a young man, was a voracious reader who consumed every piece of print he possibly could get his hands on in the course of an impoverished childhood and printer's apprenticeship in northern New England. And he absorbed these assumptions, these ideas, this language, very, very powerfully through the course of his youth. And when he arrived in New York City in the summer of 1831 as a young 20-year-old on the make, this is sort of what was stuffed into his knapsack, these ideas about the uses of print on both individual and collective scales. And there in New York City, Greeley found a print marketplace in the midst of an explosion and on the verge of a revolution. First, new, cheap daily newspapers dedicated to covering the kind of grisly spectacle of urban life completely transformed the practice of popular journalism. And second, increasingly radical reform movements, especially abolitionism, relied heavily on printed communication to advance their causes. And through the 1830s, while striving to get by in the complex marketplace of New York City and embracing the politics of the Whig Party, Greeley formulated his own theory of popular journalism in response. And he took his existing assumptions and ideas about the uses of printed communication and mixed them with his criticisms of popular journalism and radical reform movements like abolitionism. And he basically said, popular journalism is a tremendously powerful tool, but it is one that is being squandered. It's being squandered by popular editors who are playing to the lowest common denominator. It's being squandered by radicals who are exciting the passions of the people and undermining the possibility of real reform and threatening the sanctity of the Union, especially when it comes to slavery and abolition. What was needed, Greeley said, was an editor, always with a capital E, a person who will resist the urge to entertain and titillate the public with stories about crimes and murders and fires and the whole circus of urban life, and a person who will take on the work of reform and opposition to slavery, but in a way that will be politically effective and founded on broad consensus. This was the work of journalism. As Greeley wrote in 1835, very much echoing that quote from Channing that I brought up earlier, this editor would be a, quote, oracle who would exert a potent and resistless influence over public opinion, to which they conjointly give form and consistency, but they are not less beneficent in simply creating a community of thought and feeling than in giving the right direction to it. So this theory of journalism, crafted and sharpened through Greeley's early work as the editor of a literary weekly, and then Whig campaign newspapers, became the kind of foundational theory of the New York Tribune, which Greeley founded in 1841. The Tribune, of course, was the newspaper that would make Greeley into a national figure, and it was to be, as he wrote, quote, a newspaper in the higher sense of the term, unquote. A newspaper that managed properly could inform politics, improve individuals, and build consensus. Now, if we jump ahead to the mid-1850s, we see that Greeley was remarkably successful in this venture. The Tribune was really a daily and weekly marvel, full of news, opinion, culture, ideas, practical information. It counted among its writers and editors a range of important intellectual figures of the day. And the Tribune reached an astonishing number of people, mostly while resisting what Greeley called the cultivating claptraps of the popular press. Now, even though the Tribune never had the circulation numbers of its New York City competitors like the New York Herald, its weekly and semi-weekly editions reached subscribers across the North from Maine to Minnesota. By 1856, all editions of the Tribune had about 250,000 subscribers, and by the paper's own estimate, about 5 people would read every copy, which meant that the Tribune was, quote, read by 1.25 million of intelligent, upright, and substantial people. Along with this, Greeley had become a national figure, instantly recognizable in cartoons in his white coat. Following Greeley on a Western speaking tour in 1854, Ralph Waldo Emerson marveled in a letter to Thomas Carlyle at the crowds of people traveling great distances to see what Emerson called their spiritual father. And Emerson said he does all their thinking and theory for them at a rate of $2 a year. That same year, 1854, the writer James Parton launched his career as a popular biographer with a book about Greeley, in which he said that Greeley addressed a larger number of persons than any other editor or man, and influenced a greater amount of thought and a greater number of characters than any other individual who has lived in this land. Perhaps some measure of an exaggeration there. But nonetheless, Greeley was doing precisely what he had set out to do. to shape perceptions, inform politics, and build consensus. He and his newspaper were at the center of the political events of the 1850s. Resistance to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the organization of Free State settlement of Kansas itself. Greeley and the Tribune helped to form a popular anti-slavery politics. They helped to forge the Republican Party as a coherent coalition and to imagine a common Northern identity. Again, this was the power and promise of popular journalism and printed communication in action. This was the arrival of the kind of communication-based neighborhood that Channing had envisioned back in 1829. And yet, it was also a very particular and sectionalized one. Greeley had become a kind of oracle, but he was an oracle within the North. And indeed, part of what Greeley and the Tribune had done in the 1850s was to cement what had been an elusive thing, and that is the North itself, rather than a broader national community. The language of Northern unity was really fundamental to Greeley and the Tribune's anti-slavery politics, its resistance to the slave power, and the formation of the Republican Party itself. Now, to be sure, Greeley dreamed that these ideas and principles would transcend section, and that they would awaken what Greeley saw as the kind of dormant Yankees of the Southern yeomanry. But in practice, Greeley and the Tribune's great success had come in opposition to an idea of a coherent and aggressive South, and in reshaping the narrative of national politics as a clash of parties, not as a clash of parties, but as a clash of sections. Moreover, Greeley's influence, or at least the perception of Greeley's influence, allowed pro-slavery Southerners to project their own fears and ideas about the North, about Yankees, and their hegemonic aspirations for the nation. As a Virginia editor wrote in 1855, he imagined Greeley, quote, hurling his thunderbolts at the South with impunity, giving life to that cowardly and cringing spirit with which abolitionism stalks into our kitchens and slave quarters at night. This was Greeley-phobia in action, and it, along with the Tribune's account of events in the 1850s, was a powerful shorthand for understanding sectional conflict. So to close, I think that this background is important to understanding Greeley's seemingly unaccountable twists and turns through the Civil War, Reconstruction, and his ill-fated presidential campaign of 1872. In spite of his remarkable success in shaping this Northern political coalition and giving coherence to this popular anti-slavery politics, Greeley never gave up on this broader hope of forging national consensus and his own special role within the process of forging that consensus. And so through the 1860s and 70s, when he was less involved in the day-to-day operations of the Tribune, Greeley, I suggest in my book, tried to walk off the page into national politics in hopes of being a figure who could help the nation achieve its impossible consensus. The Civil War, he insisted, must not merely result in the destruction of slavery and Union victory, but also in this broader national redemption. And it was in the service of that hope that Greeley was dictating peace terms to Abraham Lincoln, paying Jefferson Davis's bail, and urging people to clasp hands across the bloody chasm in 1872. As one review of Greeley's two-volume history of the Civil War put it, Greeley had an unfortunate habit of mistaking his opinions and sentiments for those of the nation. And I would argue that it was a habit that he had formed in his great faith in the power of print. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jake. That was fascinating. I was wondering if you could give our viewers a sense of the newspaper wars of that era and just newspapers in general. As I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about, for Greeley, the newspapers were supposed to be a unifying force. And yet when I think about the 19th century press, I think about the Herald and the World and the Tribune in New York going after each other, and newspapers in small towns throughout the country. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's absolutely true. But I also think it's central to Greeley's aspirations as a kind of reformer of the press. He wants to elevate the press above these kinds of petty squabbles. He wants to make the press independent of political parties, even though he is a Whig partisan and eventually a very important Republican partisan. He wants newspapers to be independent operators that aren't reliant upon party apparatus, and he wants the newspapers to be something more than just these things that are kind of hurling mud at one another. And he's not totally above that. He's constantly battling with other editors, both within his own party and just within New York City. He and Bennett are constantly going back and forth. But again, the aspiration is to make the newspaper into something other than that.
Right. That's interesting. How you talked about how Greeley was able to really develop a national presence in large part because he offered an opposition to the aggressive South. What was it about Greeley that gave him the platform? In other words, why was it Greeley that became so prominent and not other papers or other editors?
Well, I think a lot of it is rooted in this very, very popular weekly edition that I mentioned. For whatever reason, the Weekly Tribune becomes this kind of paper of record for what we might call the Yankee North, the kind of greater New England, extending from New England itself, kind of across parts of New York State and into the Midwest. So, as the circulation grows, as the subscription list grows, Greeley becomes this kind of proxy for this whole group of people and becomes this kind of proxy for the kind of Yankee do-gooder North. And so a lot of it is really rooted just in those circulation numbers and this perception that Greeley is the Tribune, which is not correct. I mean, people talked about this in the 19th century that, people think Greeley writes every word. People think Greeley, is actually setting the types and manning the presses himself. Right. That's not true. But there's this perception that was true in a way, because I think a lot of people were coming out of a world of the kind of local printer editor, and that idea sort of still made sense and hadn't totally faded away.
Did he do anything to foster that perception, or did it just sort of emerge?
Well, as I say in the book, he did little to dispel those ideas, and I think he very much presented himself as a latter-day kind of ink-stained printer, Benjamin Franklin character, right. And so I think he was kind of actively promoting this notion in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think that's right. We got a question from a viewer asking if you would talk about the relationship between Lincoln and Greeley.
Well, complicated.
It is.
Remember the old Facebook status? It's complicated. Very, very complicated. In that Greeley was very slow to champion Lincoln. And Greeley, especially in 1858, in Lincoln's run for the Senate, Greeley had this kind of weird flirtation with Douglas, and this is something that left a bad taste in Lincoln's mouth and other Lincoln supporters. But then in 1860, Greeley was important in the process of helping Lincoln get the nomination, and a lot of that was related to his to Greeley's history, shall we say, with Seward. But then through the war, Lincoln and Greeley have this very, 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 very kind of difficult relationship, mostly because Greeley is an incredible pain to Lincoln. Constantly kind of trying to dictate dictate to Lincoln what Lincoln should be doing, sort of presuming to tell Lincoln how to handle the war, and so forth. And by the end of the war, Lincoln has basically had it with Greeley and says that he's an old shoe, good for nothing now,
Right.
because Greeley is so all over the place through the course of the war, and really is quite free in giving his opinions to Lincoln about how he should proceed.
Their relationship went back to the 1840s, correct? They had served in Congress together.
I'm trying to think if they overlapped in Congress. I don't know how much interaction they had at that moment. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I'm curious if you know off the top of your head how Greeley responded to Lincoln's death in the pages of the Tribune or in private writings.
Yeah, I mean, Greeley kind of fell into line when Lincoln died, but throughout the war, Greeley was very critical of him, and sort of talked about him as a man who was not quite ready for the moment, who was not really up to the challenges of the age. But after Lincoln's assassination, he kind of changed his tune.
Yeah. A follow-up question from a viewer asks you to talk about the famous letter that Lincoln wrote to Horace Greeley in August of 1862. If you could sort of set the context and explain that to the viewers, and then also tell about why Lincoln chose to publish it in a Washington newspaper rather than in Greeley's Tribune. Sure.
Well, I mean, the Greeley letter is a prime example of what I was talking about before, of Greeley's kind of dictatorial relationship to Lincoln. So, in August of 1862, Greeley wrote his prayer of 20 millions, in which he urged Lincoln to take more aggressive action on slavery, and kind of laid out a whole series of demands for how Lincoln should be prosecuting the war, and the policies that he should be enforcing when it came to slavery. Lincoln wrote his famous response, in which he really kind of swatted at Greeley as if he was a gnat, but also used it as a platform for making his kind of cryptic statements about his own policy on slavery. But he chose a Washington newspaper really kind of as an affront to Greeley himself. I think I don't think he wanted to give Greeley the satisfaction of putting it in the Tribune.
That's right, and I think he was able to publish it a day earlier because Greeley didn't print. Was it on what day did Greeley not print? I forget now. Sunday, Monday.
Sunday. Yeah.
Sunday. Yeah. So he was able to run it, and then Greeley couldn't respond until Monday, and so that was another way to stick to Greeley. Right. And your word choice of dictatorial is actually, I think, the word Lincoln used in his response.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that was kind of subliminal, I think.
Yeah, at the beginning of the letter, Lincoln says, if there's anything dictatorial in your message to me, I'll defer. I'll waive it as in from an old friend.
Exactly.
Another viewer asked on this connection of Lincoln to Greeley, do we know how Greeley felt when Lincoln sent Greeley to the supposed peace conference? I think that means in Canada.
Yeah. I think humiliated, and I think that was kind of Lincoln's purpose a little bit in sending him there, saying, "Fine, if you want to tell me what to do, why don't you go and do this?" And the whole thing ended up being a tremendous embarrassment for Greeley, and so.
Can you explain that a little bit about how Greeley wasn't fully forthright with the Confederate emissaries for viewers who might not know as much about that particular moment?
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember the exact specifics of all of this. Greeley, I'm blanking on those specifics, to be honest with you.
Yeah, that's fine. So Greeley, as I recollect, Greeley goes to Canada and he only has authority to negotiate with people who have the authority to control the Confederate armies, in essence. And he put some things forward without really letting the Confederates know what authority he really had, and it ended up backfiring on him.
Right.
I was curious if you could talk a little bit about Greeley's experiences in the New York City draft riots. You write in your book about how that helped propel him to write his history of the war after, or he started, I guess, in August of 1863. Could you talk about his experiences in the draft riots and then how that influenced his writing after that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Greeley was a target. The Greeley and the Tribune building was a target in the draft riots. Greeley was seen, of course, as a person who had been central in bringing the war to emancipation, and so he was seen very much as a villain by the rioters. And there were all kinds of stories about Greeley acting in a kind of cowardly fashion in the course of the riots. But as you said, I talk about in the book, Greeley took this as a kind of moment that sort of solidified his decision to write this grand history of the Civil War. I think because it sort of clarified his understanding of this as a kind of moral and national struggle.
Yeah. A question from a viewer. Can you talk about Greeley's motivation in contributing to Jefferson Davis's bail? And so just to set the stage for viewers, Jefferson Davis gets captured in Georgia in May of 1865, held actually 20 minutes down the road from me at Fort Monroe for 2 years until, I think, May of 1867. And at that point, Davis's lawyers push for bail to be granted, and he's released, I think, on $100,000 bond. And Greeley, along with Cornelius Vanderbilt and Garrett Smith, are among those who are signatories on that. Can you talk about why Greeley was willing to sign bond for him?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Greeley, as I kind of alluded to a bit at the end of my remarks, Greeley really wanted the Civil War to result in this kind of grand and national redemption. And from a very early point after the war, he really pushed for the idea of reconciliation and reunion. And he saw the bailing Jefferson Davis out as this grand gesture of reconciliation. And again, this is a moment where he's kind of keenly aware of his own power as a kind of icon or symbol. And he thinks that doing this will be instrumental in forging this reconciliation that he hopes for.
I had read at some point that he also hoped that maybe in showing that sort of reconciliationist spirit towards Jefferson Davis, the chief of the former Confederates, that he also hoped that maybe African-American men would be given the franchise in return for that.
Yeah.
And as we've been talking about Greeley and these different episodes, whether it's the famous letter with Lincoln in 1862, or him favoring Stephen Douglas in 1858, or saying secession could be okay in 1860, 61, and then the Canada stuff in 65, and the Jefferson Davis bail in 67. Is Greeley, it's easy to judge from hindsight, but is Greeley naive? I mean, he seems to be on the wrong side of a lot of these issues, even though we think of him generally as being on the right side because he's pushing for abolitionism.
Yes. I think in a way he's very naive. I think that he has, in particular when we're talking about Reconstruction, he has this strange faith that you can have it both ways. That there can be black suffrage, there can be the recognition of black citizenship, and also full kind of full amnesty for former Confederates. And I think the naivete is kind of rooted in this faith in the power of the American nation itself. He thinks that people are going to kind of, to use a Lincoln phrase, swell to the chorus of the Union. He constantly thinks that that's going to happen. And it doesn't. And one of the larger points that I make in the book is that American nationalism is this very, very bizarre thing in the 19th century that's kind of impossible to pull together.
Does he ever express disappointment in the fact that newspapers are not able to do what he wants them to do?
Yes, he does. But I think he never really gives up on the idea that newspapers are this powerful instrument. So I think a lot of after the war, he talks about the failure of his vision, and just saying, well, the problem was that people in the South couldn't read my newspaper. If only the Tribune had been able to get to people in the South, if my ideas had been more widely disseminated, maybe we wouldn't have had to have this war.
Although ironically, his articles were fairly widely disseminated in the South, maybe edited and certainly with editorial comment, but Southerners were reading what he was writing and they just didn't like it.
Right.
I think.
No, that's a great point. But this is something that he says a number of times during and after the war. If only they could read the Tribune in the South, or if only they could have read the Tribune in full, I guess.
Right. We've got time for, I think, one more, and this can sort of take us to the end of, literally to the end of Greeley's life. Can you talk about his 1872 presidential campaign?
Yeah, sure. So I talk at the end of my remarks about the idea of Greeley walking off the page.
Right.
And I really think that's kind of what he thought he could do in 1872. He thought that he could be this figure of reconciliation and reunion, and thought of himself as this national figure who could sort of orchestrate this seemingly impossible reconciliation. And he was terribly wrong. That's not how it worked at all. And it was to his great and eternal shame that was the case.
Yeah. And then he died, was it right after the actual election day?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right after, very soon after the election. So December of 1872. Right. It's almost like he dies of a broken heart.
Yeah. No kidding. Greeley is one of those fascinating figures in American history. And again, to our viewers, I commend this book to you, fresh off the presses from last year, 2019. And it just gives wonderful insight into how we think about the press in American history. And obviously the press in America today is still a very important subject. So this gives great historical perspective. I want to thank you all at home so much for joining us today. And I want to thank Jake for giving us these wonderful remarks and a lot to think about. I also especially want to thank Ford's Theater for hosting this event. It's our 4th one out of 5. We're going to meet again in 2 weeks at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on August 3rd. And we're actually going to have an Abraham Lincoln Institute board member, Jason Emerson. He's going to talk about his recent book, Marry Lincoln for the Ages. And you'll want to be sure to tune in for that. Until then, please stay safe and healthy and keep reading good books about Abraham Lincoln.